For those of you who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I run the LSAT blog. I also host the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. And tonight, I thought I would do something a little bit different and go back to basics, focus on LSAT prep fundamentals. Too often, we assume that students know more than they do and jump straight into the actual LSAT problems and explanations of those problems without covering the basics of what it takes to succeed on the LSAT. And that's something I honestly could have used a lot back when I was studying, because like many of you, I jumped in and did exam after exam, measuring my results, being happy or sad about my progress on those results, and then moved on to the next exam when I should have slowed down and made a plan of attack to learn the basics, to learn about conditional reasoning, to learn about reading arguments critically, to being engaged with my reading comprehension so that I would be interested in what I was doing. Because the first step to doing well in this exam is developing a proper appreciation for it, for what goes into creating it, and for what it takes to succeed on this exam. And so tonight, I will go over a lot of the questions that you've submitted to me in advance, covering LSAT prep fundamentals, properly setting up an LSAT study plan so that you can set yourself up for success. And so anyway, I've asked you to please submit your questions in the chat here. There's a chat function within Zoom that makes it really easy to ask questions, and I will do my best to get to every single one of them over the course of the evening. I've got some questions submitted in advance to the side here, and I will try to run through those as quickly and efficiently as possible. But if you would like any clarification or have any follow-ups, please feel free to ask, and I'll do my best to get to those as well. So one of the most common questions I got was around figuring out where to start and making a study plan. There are tons of books out there, tons of exams out there, tons of resources out there. In a way, almost too many resources sometimes. And so I recommend making a plan of attack so that step by step, day by day, you know exactly what to do and what not to do. And I have some study plans as samples on my website, the LSAT blog. I have some in my courses as well. And they all revolve around the same fundamental core principles that I call the LASER approach to LSAT studying. LASER is an acronym standing for learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review. Learning is theory, reading textbook chapters, watching videos, going over the fundamentals. That is step one, too often overlooked. Step two is A for accuracy, doing individual questions by type in order to drill, to know what it is that they're asking you to do. What is a question stem for a strengthen question asking you to do, as opposed to weaken or flaw or necessary assumption? And how do ordering games differ from grouping games? You don't want to just dive in and do a full section of games or a full section of logical reasoning without understanding the various component question types. If you know what they're asking you to do, it will be, of course, much easier to actually do that thing. S is for sections, which comes next, and that's doing individual timed 35-minute sections to work on your pacing so that you don't get bogged down, so you don't run out of time, so that you actually have time to spare, which would be nice. E is for exams and endurance, which is doing full-length 5-section timed exams, because it's grueling. You're there for 3 hours minimum to do those 5 sections. Plus there's the break, plus there's the proctors, plus there could be any sort of digital tech snafus with the digital LSAT or the proctors. And so we don't hope for that. We don't necessarily even expect it, but you do want to be prepared for it if it comes up. And so endurance, having the endurance to be there for a while, sitting there dealing with this exam on test day, you want to be ready for that. And so I recommend doing ideally at least 10 full-length timed exams before test day. And finally, R is for review, which is too often overlooked. And review is where you analyze in excruciating detail everything you got wrong and everything you had difficulty with. So once again, the 5 are learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review. The LASER approach to LSAT studying, it underlies all of my LSAT study plans. Now, those break down for you day by day, exactly what to be working on. There's also off days built in, but a common question I get is, how do I make time to study? How do I fit it in? How do I manage my time? And this requires, like I said before, buy-in from friends and family and employers to support you in making this a priority in your life, carving out the time, blocking it out in your schedule. So that may involve not taking on overtime at work. That may involve getting support from others to take the load off of you a little bit, whether in personal relationships or in professional relationships at work. It may also involve blocking off time in your schedule, in your calendar, where nothing else can get in the way. I would recommend, if you're in college, treating this at least as if it were a 6-credit class at minimum, which you really should, because this is more important than your entire undergraduate GPA combined, this one single exam. And so, of course, you should treat it more seriously than your college classes, while, of course, achieving some kind of balance so that your grades don't suffer. So maybe you take fewer courses during the semester during which you're studying. That's one way you could do it. Or if you're working, you get to work an hour early, or you stay an hour late, or you carve out the time during lunch just to squeeze in the prep wherever you can. Because once you get home, the distractions abound. It's too easy to get wrapped up in something else or put on your PJs and just veg out for a bit, which is fine to do, but that's also not studying. And so if you can study while you're in work mode or school mode, you'll get a lot more done. As for when to take the LSAT, I had this question in advance, and I see it's also in the chat here. So it's a big one, when to take it. There's no one right time to take the LSAT. It's really whenever you're feeling ready, whenever you will have sufficient time to study. So it could be in the spring, could be the summer, whenever, if you're in college, whenever your course load is lighter and you have the time, or whenever your family obligations or work obligations are a little bit lighter. That's when you would study. As for when it's ideal from an admissions timeline perspective, I would say take it early enough so that you could apply at the very beginning of the cycle if possible. So we're currently looking at towards the January LSAT. That is the last LSAT I would take and still apply in the current cycle. It's the latest at which I would apply. After that, if you're going for February or March or April or June, I would then say you could take it then, but don't apply until the beginning of next cycle. But the nice thing about taking it in the spring or summer is that you then can, in fact, apply at the very beginning of the cycle when applications open. And when you apply early, your odds are a bit better, and there's also more scholarship money available. Taking it in January and applying at the end of this cycle is okay. It won't necessarily hurt you a lot, but all things being equal, better to apply earlier than later. Plus, if you aim for the spring or summer and you need to retake, you could still retake and apply, relatively early towards the fall. That would be okay too. So not a whole lot of downside there. Let's see other follow-ups around when to take the LSAT. All LSATs are equal in difficulty. No one LSAT test month is harder or easier than another. So I don't think there's a huge downside to taking it in one month versus the other. The tests are all equated. They're all roughly the same. So no big deal whether you take it 1 month or a different month. You could take it as a sophomore, take it as a junior or a senior, or after graduating, it's all good. LSAT scores are good for 5 years. And so for that reason, you could take it as a sophomore and then apply to law school once you've graduated. That would be okay. But I don't think there's any reason to take it that early, especially if your plans may change and you may end up deciding that you don't want to go to law school after all, so you don't want to do all that prep for nothing. So I think sophomore year or freshman year might be a little bit too early, but end of sophomore, beginning of junior, I think is perfectly reasonable. So I think I've covered all of those related questions there. Let's continue with the pre-submitted ones. Avoiding a test day drop. So a lot of times students will take exams in the comfort of their own home where things are pretty smooth and comfortable. And then test day, the proctors are distracting, the other test takers are annoying, and the fire alarm goes off and then your score plummets. That could happen. It does happen sometimes. And two things. One is properly simulating test day conditions. The other is dealing with nerves and anxiety. So properly simulating means taking tests under as realistic conditions as possible. So you have strict timing and mild distractions, and you're not being liberal with snacks and bathroom breaks and things of that nature. So don't do all your tests in a totally sterile environment like a library or your house. Maybe do one or two at a coffee shop, or do one or two in a common area where there is some ambient noise and some other people walking around. As for nerves and anxiety, the biggest recommendations are sleep, diet, exercise, and some kind of mindfulness, meditation, or relaxation of some kind. All of those things have a big impact, and they're often overlooked. And so they really are required for you to be at your top peak performance on test day. Mindfulness in particular is often overlooked. Doesn't have to be spiritual in nature at all. Could be as simple as closing your eyes for a few moments and focusing on your breath. Could really have a big impact in the long term, just a couple minutes a day. And going from there, even for the next 5 weeks before the January LSAT, could be enormously useful for you. Not much cost to trying it out if it's just a couple minutes a day. A few good apps for this are Calm and Headspace. There are also several guided meditations on YouTube that could be worth looking into. Let's see what else. Timing strategies for each section of the exam. So you've got games, reasoning, and reading comprehension as the three scored sections of the LSAT. And recommendations are somewhat similar, somewhat different for each section of the exam. Biggest thing to know is that logical reasoning has a general order of difficulty. The questions get progressively tougher as you go through the section. So questions 1 through 10 will be significantly easier than 11 through 25 or so. So I would recommend going through the first 10 more quickly to build up a time bank to be able to better attack the tougher questions later in the section. So I might say do the first 10 questions in about 10 to 12 minutes, build up that time bank so you can do 11 through 25 in slightly longer than the average amount of time allotted. And maybe you'll even have a time bank built up to go back and handle the toughest questions that you wanted to skip in the moment. For logic games, I won't talk about order of approach. I will instead talk about building inferences up front, making a solid main diagram or even multiple main diagrams, laying out the major possibilities for the game. So basically, slow down, make your inferences, see if you can make frames or worlds or templates or multiple possibilities before jumping into the questions. The questions are not best solved through brute force, meaning trying out all 5 answers. That could technically get you the correct answer, but it's quite inefficient. So you're much better off slowing down, seeing if you can make any inferences up front before getting into the questions. And for reading comprehension, I would say take the time to slow down and thoroughly understand the main idea of the passage before going on to the questions, and don't get too bogged down in the details in the passage. That information is there to trip you up and slow you down. It's obviously very dense text that's not meant to be easily understood by a pre-law student. And they want you to get bogged down in it, but don't fall into their trap. Don't get absorbed by all the minutia. Just flag it, note where it appears so that you can go back and find it when you need to. Got a question looping back to the question of study plans and timelines. How long should you study for? Great question. I recommend a minimum of 3 months, but ideally 5 to 6 months in order to achieve your fullest potential. A lot of different opinions on this. Some people will say 2 months is good or 6 weeks is even good. In my experience, that's not enough time to both build the foundation and work on pacing and endurance as well. You could maybe build a foundation in 6 weeks or 2 months, but to also become proficient at solving the questions under timed conditions, I think requires a bit more time. I laid out that 5-step approach, LASER, learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review. And to do all 5 phases of that in only 6 weeks or 8 weeks, I think is simply not realistic for people who have other obligations. So 5 to 6 months to achieve your fullest potential. And that could be even as little as 10 to 15 hours per week. If you could do more, that's great. But people will ask, how much time does it take? What is enough? And I'm hesitant to give firm recommendations on what is enough because it depends on a lot of factors. If you want to achieve your full potential on this, you don't really ask, is this enough? I think you're better off just saying, I will do everything I can to master this exam and achieve my fullest potential. And that doesn't necessarily involve doing every LSAT ever released. There are 89 numbered at the moment and a handful that are unnumbered. But just because there are that many doesn't mean that you have to do them all. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, there were maybe half that number, and that number would have been more than enough as well. So I think for anyone taking the LSAT in 3 months from now, I would say focus on the exams in the 50s and up. So maybe do exam 52 to present and focus on those. Over a period of 5 to 6 months, you could work on the most recent half of exams, most recent 40 to 50, and that would be more than enough. You could also do less and do them multiple times. I'd rather you do fewer exams and review them in more detail than do more exams but only address them on a surface level. So feel free to ask any follow-ups on this. I got some questions on admissions and LSAT score ranges and then digital LSAT, which I will get to, and then loop back to some other general questions I had on the agenda. Do I expect that the changes in the LSAT will affect the score ranges that schools expect? I'm not sure exactly what changes this person's referring to. Feel free to follow up if you want to specify. If you're referring to the LSAT getting tougher, I think ultimately that doesn't have a huge impact because, again, it's entirely the same pool of test takers and things shift fairly gradually over time. So even if the LSAT got a bit tougher this year, it's a kind of like a 3-year moving average because people might take it last year and then apply now. People might take it now and apply a year from now or 2 years from now. So ultimately, I think these medians change slightly, but not significantly. And we also have to consider the changes in who is applying. So for example, this year, there are more high scorers applying than in the past because someone could get a high score and then choose to do something else rather than go to law school. So I don't really see this as having a huge impact overall. Do I recommend doing prep only with digital LSAT materials, or is it still worth using prep materials from before the change? So personally, I've revamped all of my materials for the digital LSAT specifically because this is a big change. It's worth making some adjustments for that change. But the content of the exam itself has not changed at all. There's still 1 game section, 2 logical reasoning sections, and 1 reading comprehension section. And the questions themselves have not really changed. This is a format change or a stylistic change in terms of the content delivery, but the content itself is not different in any way since last year. So I think everything prior is still perfectly relevant, except for any advice about taking the paper LSAT specifically. So any advice on, for example, bubbling a Scantron is no longer relevant if you're taking the digital format, because it actually still is paper outside of North America. So those in Europe, Asia, Latin America, Africa, still paper there, although I expect in a couple of years, LSAT will roll out the digital to them as well. Best way to transition from paper to digital. So a couple of major changes. I'll focus on 2 for now. One is that you can only see 1 question at a time. And so you want to get used to not being able to see the entire bird's eye view of an entire reading comp passage or an entire game or a 2-page spread of logical reasoning. Only 1 question at a time. So you could either go really old school and take a piece of paper, cut out a hole in it, like a square, and overlay that on top of each individual question in your books to limit your field division to 1 question at a time. You could do that. Or you could simply go on LSAC's site at familiar.lsac.org, and I will type that in the chat here. There are currently a couple of questions, a couple of exams in the digital LSAT format. So you could go on LSAC's site, ideally with a tablet, and mimic that experience. Practice with the digital. Any old tablet will do. A Samsung, an iPad, an Amazon Fire. Any of those are perfectly fine to study from. It's not very smartphone friendly, so I wouldn't suggest using it on a phone. And a computer doesn't have the touchscreen interactivity. So a tablet, if you can, at least once or twice, is the best way to simulate this experience. The other thing I'll point out is that you can flag questions on the digital LSAT to come back to later, which is really nice. So I mentioned earlier, logical reasoning. You might flag the toughest questions, skip them, come back later. On the digital LSAT, you can flag it and then a little flag icon will appear on the bottom navigation bar, so you can see at a glance exactly not only what you've completed, but also what you flagged and skipped to come back to at the end. I got a question about prep books to use and resources to use. Well, the best resources, of course, is the actual LSAT exams published by the Law School Admission Council. They are available in books of 10 exams for about $20 each. And I have a list of them on my site. I'll see if I can pull up the link for you here. And basically, this is the best prep material you can possibly use. A lot of other books will use fake LSAT questions or contain mistakes in terms of being unrealistic or contain typos of some kind. You definitely don't want to use those. Better off using the actual LSAT exams. Aside from that, I would also recommend those study plans I mentioned earlier that lay out exactly what to be doing every single day, specifically how to use free resources like articles on my site in conjunction with the actual LSAT prep test questions. As for how the sections are laid out, games, reasoning, reading comp, they could be in any order. It is somewhat arbitrary. So you could have games first, then reasoning, then reading comp, then another reasoning section, then another section for the experimental that could be of any type. So your experimental section could be games, reasoning, or reading comprehension. Any of the three, you don't know which one it's going to be, and it could be any of the 5 sections in your exam. They're not going to tell you, of course, because they want you to give it your full effort. So you want to practice, like it could be game day where you don't know what you're getting. If your worst nightmare is getting 2 logical reasonings back to back, practice that. If it's 3 reading comps back to back, practice that. Any order at all could happen to you. I have seen people, in fact, get 3 logical reasonings back to back. A lot of people, that's not their cup of tea, but it is entirely possible. I had a more nuanced question in the chat here about avoiding dumb mistakes, like tougher inference questions or avoiding dumb mistakes in logic games. So I'll approach the logic games question first. And I think it comes down to slowing down and taking the time to make sure that you have correctly laid out what the rule is actually saying before you go on to the questions, before you go on to making inferences or making a full main diagram. Just slowing down and double checking. It is worth the effort, because if you make one small mistake in a game's rule, that will carry forward through the rest of the game. And as a result, you might make several errors over the course of the game because they're all based on that fundamental mistake from the very beginning. So basically just slow down. And for logical reasoning inference questions, assuming that they involve formal logic, which means conditionals, which means diagramming, like games, same thing. Slow down. What were your conditional indicators? What were your evidence conclusion indicators? Did you properly ID them, even in the absence of there being an actual indicator word? So if you're looking at what's the relationship of evidence conclusion, or for a perceived conditional statement, what is the conditionality? Is it A requires B, or is it B requires A? There are certain indicator words that it's really important to have a grasp on so that you won't misidentify what it is that you're looking for. So I thought it might be useful, in the interest of helping you get the ability to recognize an argument structure, to give you some of these indicators now. This is not an exhaustive list, but it is a starting off point for you to properly ID them. So a big part of the LSAT in both logic games and logical reasoning is conditionality, conditional statements, conditional reasoning. And this is important because it relates to making inferences. So with conditional statements, you have the sufficient condition and the necessary condition, and they have very different logical relationships. A sufficient condition establishes what is enough to require something else to occur. So if we have the statement A requires B, that means whenever we have A, then we will have B. Or every time we have A, then we have B. Or all A's are also B's. So that might be something like saying, if something is an apple, for example, then it's a fruit. And I'm typing this in the chat here. If something is an apple, then it's a fruit. So all apples are fruit. Or whenever I have an apple, then I also have a fruit. Or whenever I eat apples, then I am eating fruit. So the words when, every, all, any, those are all sufficient condition indicators. Or we also, so that's important because that's activating, or that's telling us having an apple is enough to know that we have a fruit. Or apples, I eat apples only when I'm choosing to eat fruit. So apple only when fruit means if it's an apple, then it's a fruit. The phrase only when introduces the necessary condition of being fruit, or eating apples requires that you eat fruit, or if you're eating an apple, then you must be eating fruit. Requires and must are indicating the necessary condition, establishing requirement that you are in fact eating fruit. So that's a little bit of fun with sufficient necessary indicator words. I'll give you another example here. I'm typing in the chat once again. If I eat pizza, then I will be happy. So pizza requires happiness, or I eat pizza only when I am happy. And you can see that the timing there can be played around with a little bit. I eat pizza only when I'm happy means I was happy first, then I chose to eat pizza as a result of being happy, like it was a celebration. So if you see me eating pizza, then you know I must have been happy. Or alternatively, if I eat pizza, then I will be happy, meaning that pizza will make me happy. So the timing can be played around with a little bit, but either way, pizza is the sufficient condition and happiness is the necessary condition. So we could say, once again, every time I eat pizza, then I will be happy. It could be eating every pizza makes me happy. But either way, if pizza, then happiness. Pizza requires happiness. Now, the contrapositive is a logically equivalent statement that appears different in framing, but has the same truth value. It means the same thing. So if we are given the statement that pizza requires happiness, the contrapositive would be the reversal and negation of that original statement. Now, I imagine that many of you are already proficient with the contrapositive, and so please feel free to type in the chat what you think the contrapositive would be here, where we were taking the logical equivalent statement from this initial rule and translating it to be logically equivalent yet appearing different. So we reverse the order of the variables around the arrow and we negate both. So I'll give you a moment to play around with that, type your answers in the chat, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. Awesome. You guys are rock stars. We got a couple great responses here, all essentially saying, if not H, then not P. So if I'm not happy, then I must not have been eating pizza, for example, because if I eat pizza, then you know I would be happy. So pizza requires happiness, contrapositive, not happy, then not pizza. So pizza was positive at the beginning, now it's negative, and at the end, happiness was positive and at the end, now it's negative and at the beginning. Why is this useful? Because sometimes they will give you a conditional statement in its original form and then another variable that is in the negative, so you can't easily link them together. But through taking the contrapositive, you then can in fact link them smoothly. This becomes especially important in logic games, but it does also appear in logical reasoning as well. Now, when attempting to take the contrapositive, there are sometimes improper translations that do not give you something logically equivalent to the original, and it's a mistake to make that inference. So I will lay out a couple of those now. One of them is taking the negation of the original without taking the reversal as well. So if we negate something, we end up with simply a negative version of the original, but it is not the contrapositive and it is not logically equivalent. So given pizza requires happiness, the negation would be not pizza, then not happy, which would be saying that if I don't have pizza, then I will not be happy, assuming that there is nothing else in the world that could make me happy aside from pizza. So assuming that nothing else in the world would make me happy except for pizza, that pizza is the only thing that could achieve this goal. But in fact, pizza is simply one thing. It is enough to make me happy, but other things could make me happy as well. Another improper translation is the reversal, where we switch the order of the variables around the arrow, but we do not negate them. So that would be saying from the original, pizza requires happiness. Reversal is happiness requires pizza, which once again is making the mistake of assuming that pizza is the only thing that can make me happy. Nothing else will achieve that goal. So pizza is enough to make me happy, but could other things make me happy as well? Of course. Plenty of other things could make me happy as well. Pizza is simply one of those things. It is enough to do it, but it is not required in order to make me happy. Now, once again, like I said, this comes up a lot in games, also in logical reasoning. If you want an example of places this comes up in games, I have several examples for you laid out in this link here. The first category of games is a list of logic games that repeated on future exams, where there were several grouping in-out conditional chain games like Birds in the Forest, Fruit Stand, CD's Game, Photographs, Volunteers Game. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, that's totally fine. It just means that you have not done those specific games yet. They are the first category in the list of which I have linked to you. And I highly recommend checking that out and becoming proficient in this, because this is something that has repeated on many, many exams. And it's hard at first, but it is truly perfectible. So well worth checking that out. I highly recommend it. In terms of logical reasoning, this comes up on some inference questions, some sufficient assumption questions, and some parallel questions. Well worth studying, well worth becoming comfortable with. And if you want more, I have a couple of other conditional statements I will provide to you in the chat. Feel free to drill those on your own and then email me the responses or type them in the chat for later. If you want to check each other out on these and see what your thoughts are, it's well worth practicing and drilling these. I also thought it might be useful to talk about some evidence and conclusion indicator words as well in terms of recognizing argument structure and different parts of arguments. So evidence indicators might include things like after all, because, and for example. And conclusion indicators include words and phrases like thus, therefore, and it follows that. You will not always have indicator words for either evidence, conclusion, or sufficient and necessary, but it's worth recognizing the different roles that each part plays, because if you can tell that, then you know what the claim is that's being made, and you can better evaluate the method of reasoning and determine for yourself to what extent it's valid and to what extent they are failing to consider things or simply not bother to explicitly state things. So anyway, those were a lot of the general questions. Let me see what else is in the chat that I may have missed. And if I missed your question, please feel free to resubmit it, and I will do my best to get to it. Got a question saying reading comp is boring. What do I do? So yeah, reading comprehension can be quite boring and difficult to get into, but I would recommend doing everything you can to become interested in it, because you'll do better if you're interested. You'll be more engaged, your mind won't wander, and you'll just perform better overall on this exam. And so I recommend reading dense, difficult text of the type that you will see on the LSAT. And while there is no substitute for actual LSAT passages, there are some publications that talk about the same kinds of concepts that do appear on the LSAT. I recommend in particular Scientific American and The Economist. And for the digital LSAT, you could read them online to get used to reading difficult text on a screen, because usually the quality of what we read on a screen is not quite as high as what we read in books or journals or academic articles, things of that nature. So you could even take it to the next level and copy paste the article text into reading apps. In particular, I will recommend two. One is Spreeder.com and one is phrasereader.com. And these allow you to copy paste text into a text field and display it to yourself at different speeds. So you could put yourself on a reading comprehension treadmill of sorts, where you display the text to yourself at increasingly faster speeds, which is good because you want to read quickly and you want to retain what you're reading. And so it gives it to you in bite-sized chunks. And it doesn't work for everyone, but could be useful to see where it takes you to help you increase your reading speed. I also recommend caricaturing the different viewpoints in passages to make them more relatable and easier to get a hold on. So for example, If there's an older viewpoint and an updated version, you could have old versus new, or incomplete versus complete, or right versus wrong, or general versus specific application for dual passages, for example. Whatever you can do to make it more relatable is well worth doing. And that will differ from person to person. Obviously, reading comprehension is more of a personal section than the others, and that makes it sometimes harder to improve upon significantly, but it's worth trying. Any trick or hack you can use, it's worth making the investment. And so do whatever you can to do more reading on a screen. And if you have the prep test PDFs, you could also even copy paste those into these apps I mentioned. Also, for note-taking and reading comp, given that the LSAT is digital now, you can no longer draw freehand on the questions themselves. You can't draw freehand on the tablet. You're doing all your work on scratch paper to the side. So as a result, I would say keep your note-taking very minimal. Highlighting and underlining is not a substitute for comprehension. So keep it minimal, maybe a couple of keywords summarizing the major viewpoints presented and, of course, the author's opinion, if any, and have that be really all that you mark down. Got a more nuanced question here about the phrase must certainly be. How would I approach questions with that phrase? Well, if you're saying it must certainly be the case that, then that would be a conclusion indicator to me. I suppose this somewhat depends upon the context. So if we were saying something like, if I eat pizza, it will certainly be the case that I'm happy, then pizza is the evidence and must certainly be the case would be your conclusion. I can't really see a case in which it must certainly be would be the evidence there. I guess I would need to really see the context and see the full text of the question to better advise on this case. But to me, that I don't really see that as being a clear indicator of either sort. The word must in isolation, of course, would be a necessary condition indicator. But I can't say more than that, and I don't think this is the right context to go deep on this one here. I got a question asking me to give a general overview of the different sections of the exam, which I can certainly do. I think that is more within the context of the discussion for tonight. And so, overview of the sections. In logic games, we have, so first off, the LSAT is comprised of 4 scored sections, 1 unscored experimental section, and 1 unscored writing sample. So the scored sections are games, reasoning, another reasoning, and reading comp. Then you have your unscored experimental section. That could be any one of those 3 types. Then you have the LSAT writing, which is now digital, and you complete later after the exam, not even on the same day necessarily. Within games, you have 4 games, which are 4 different segments of the game section. They include ordering, grouping games, combination games, mapping games, pattern games, circle games, and rare or curveball games. That's obviously more than 4 game types. There's no defined number of game types you will have within the game section. So you could have, theoretically, 2 ordering, 2 grouping, or 1 ordering, 1 grouping, 1 combo, 1 curveball. These categorizations are externally imposed by prep providers. That's not a way that LSAC is going to notate them on the exam itself. But it's useful to have this framework to know these different categories in order to better have a mental framework for how to diagram these and how to better solve them, because they do relate to each other loosely within those categories. And many prep materials, mine included, will lay them out within those frameworks. And we can also go into subtypes of different types of ordering, different types of grouping, but I don't want to overwhelm you with too much in this discussion. Then for logical reasoning, it's half the exam, 2 out of the 4 scored sections. And logical reasoning has many, many different types of questions. You might even say 14 or 15 different question types. And these are categorized typically based upon a word or phrase in the question stem, which is the short question appearing after an argument. That's about 1 paragraph or 3 or 4 sentences typically, or less even. These are arguments typically, or fact sets that ask you to identify something about the argument or do something to the argument, like strengthen it or weaken it. There are many, many different types. You might be asked to identify the flaw in an argument, or strengthen or weaken it, or provide a necessary assumption that underlies the argument, or a sufficient assumption that would guarantee the argument's validity. Many more types than that as well. Games is the easiest to improve upon significantly because it's more mathematical in nature. You're dealing there with short puzzles that are not truly mathematical, but have some relation there. And that's involving more deductive reasoning or formal logic, where you're making diagrams and making inferences based upon different pieces. Logical reasoning involves a little bit of that, but is typically more involved with informal logic, inductive reasoning, which is more real-world evaluation of arguments, the type that you might see in the news or in the media or in real-world conversations or debates. Excuse me. Then finally, there's reading comprehension. And reading comprehension involves 3 long passages and 2 short dual or comparative passages on a related topic. So similar to games, it's 4 different segments, 4 different passages or groups of passages. Here you have a passage on each of humanities, natural science, social science, and law. Those are the general topics. And one of those will also be the dual or comparative. One of those will also typically be on minorities or women's issues, just to add an element of diversity to the exam. And it's hard. It's hard. I think it's the hardest section to improve upon significantly, but it is still learnable as well. And I think the key here, like with logical reasoning, is to recognize that you're not being tested on the substance. It's not a test of memorization or facts. It's a test of argumentative structure. And so you want to think more structurally, think more about evaluating arguments for their pieces, like evidence and conclusion, rather than what they're at, the information itself. Because this is not really a test of content, it's a test of reasoning ability, and it's testing your ability to think critically and skeptically about what you're reading and not to take everything at face value. So I think that's my general overview of the exam itself. Like I said, the experimental section could be any one of games, reasoning, or reading comp. And the writing section is also not scored like the experimental section. And it's typically been neglected because it wasn't scored. But now that it's being typed and it's digital, law schools might be slightly more likely to look at it and take it more seriously because they can actually read what you're writing. So I would give it more attention than otherwise. I might do a practice run or 2. But because it isn't scored, I still wouldn't take it as seriously as the actual LSAT content, the multiple choice content. And I wouldn't worry about it for now because you're not dealing with it until after the exam anyway. You actually have up to 1 year after the LSAT to complete it before applying to law school. But law schools do want to see it, so don't wait too long before completing it. But now is not the time. Get the LSAT out of the way, be done with it, and then move on from there to the other parts like the writing sample and the other parts of the application. Now, has LSAC released the dates for the 2020 exams? No, they have not. LSAC works on a strange calendar that runs from June to May. And so they have to release the dates up to May 2020. The last one's actually in April. And then at some point, I imagine in the early spring, they will open up the dates for the June 2020 LSAT and beyond. But for now, you can only register up through April. And as far as I know, I haven't seen the dates for 2020 and beyond yet. I expect they will continue to offer the LSAT about 10 times per year, up from the previous 4 times per year. It used to only be February, June, September, or October, and then December. Now it's nearly every month, but I don't know the exact dates. I expect they will be June, July, September, October, November, then January, similar to what's occurred this year. As for when you get your results, they typically come back about 3 weeks after the scored LSAT, after the test administration. I mean, that's when you get your score back. With time, they may get faster with it, being that it's digital now, but at least for everything we can see right now, the score release dates are still approximately 3 weeks after the actual LSAT administration. Anyway, I've been forging ahead as long as I can. You could probably tell my throat's a little bit sore. I'm getting over a cold, so I apologize for all the coughing and tripping over my words a little bit. But anyway, I think that's all the questions in the chat here that I'm able to get to tonight. If nothing else, I will leave off for now, but I appreciate you all coming. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions moving on. But I am going to leave off here for now. I'm happy to help however I can with self-study, with the courses. I'm here for you. And we all have a good night. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.